So I'm here to introduce the presentation, Monitoring and Mitigating of Wildlife Vehicle Collisions. So this presentation is really about collaboration and partnerships. Our wildlife program at the DOT, which is primarily run by our wildlife biologist, Wyatt Mack. Every day, all of our work is dependent on collaborations. So we collaborate with the North Dakota Game and Fish, National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, and these collaborative efforts in terms of wildlife, how they actually enter our infrastructure is wildlife crossings and wildlife accommodations. So when the presentation team talks about these things, think structures, wildlife structures like an underpass, fencing, also accommodations could be things as simple as removing riprap, making paths that wildlife can go through. So that's what those collaboration efforts lead to. There's another aspect here, not just the implementation, but the planning. And that's what led to this partnership with UND and with the Wildlife Connectivity Institute. So I'd like the presentation team to come forward, please. So I'm going to introduce the team here. We have three presenters. We have Dr. Susan Felege, who is with UND Biology, and we have Lawson Frey, who is who is a graduate student who is working on our project for wildlife collision data collection, and the final will be Dr. Patricia Cramer, who is with the Wildlife Connectivity Issue, who will talk about, with the data and with the planning that went into this study, how can we use those to make accommodations for the future. So I'd like to begin with Dr. Susan Felege, please.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I do not have any cards up my sleeve, and we don't have to have any volunteers to figure out where the card went in this presentation. I want to first acknowledge we have a really great team, and I think the highlight of partnerships is super important, so thank you for that, Andy. And as mentioned, Wyatt's not here, but he's a critical part of our team, along with Lawson and Patty. To start us off, I want to make a quick acknowledgement on that partnership with DOT and also North Dakota Game and Fish that's been really valuable. And then I also want to highlight that I'm going to use some work from another graduate student, Amalia Jorgensen, who is not here, but this is some of her work that I'll be talking about today. As I suspect most folks in this room are aware that wildlife vehicle collisions are a major public safety issue. And in the U.S., they cause more than 200 human deaths each year, 26,000 human injuries, and cost the U.S. over $8 billion. About 5% of all collisions nationwide are involving wildlife. Wildlife vehicle collisions also pose a real conservation challenge. Research has found that more than 365 million vertebrates can be killed annually by motor vehicles. Roads can restrict their movement and cause fragmentation across the landscape, which has further problems for their populations. In short, wildlife vehicle collisions are a big deal for humans and for wildlife. Here in North Dakota, more than 18% of all crashes are wildlife vehicle collisions. Remember, that national average was about 5%, and that costs North Dakota about $56 million a year. There's a lot of opportunities, which Andy started to talk about, with things like crossings, where you have structures that animals can go over or under. We have accommodations, where you might remove riprap or create paths underneath bridges. And there's a lot of new technology that's also emerging, like driver detection systems that could be implemented. But to do that, we have to know where the wildlife collisions are and what wildlife species are involved. So to expand on that partnership that Andy mentioned with North Dakota DOT, we got involved in 2022 and We invited Dr. Cramer with the Wildlife Connectivity Institute to join us in 2023. The idea of looking at reducing and managing wildlife vehicle collisions in the state. We wanted to learn what's been done, what data do we have here in North Dakota, and where can we go? I'm going to first talk about a few mitigation methods. Now, there's a lot of different things that have been used, and I'm going to highlight just a couple that we typically think of and discuss sort of their role. First off, signs. Most of you have probably traveled along the highway and seen some kind of sign like you see pictured here. These signs are typically out there all year long. All right? Those are easy signs to be really habituated to. Many of us ignore them after we've seen them a couple of times, which means that they're probably not terribly effective, and research backs that up. There's seasonal signs that might come out at certain points of the year, and then there's dynamic ones like you saw that directed you to the right place to come into this building for this conference. All of those have different levels of effectiveness, but for the most part still aren't terribly effective compared to other methodologies. Speed limit reductions is another thing, and I'm going to talk about speed a couple different times. In order to reduce speed, though, and use that as an effective method, it has to be less than 45 miles per hour in order to actually reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. I made my way from Grand Forks, North Dakota, all the way across here to Bismarck. I can tell you driving on I-94 at less than 45 miles an hour would not have been super ideal. Sometimes people use things like reflectors or offensive light, the idea that the lights hit and the animals might be deterred by that. But again, all of these are not terribly effective. More effective mitigation methods tend to be things such as fencing. But that fencing, if you put it along the roads, can also have problems with that connectivity issue for wildlife being able to cross it. Some animals can cross fences better than others, and some of them, it depends on the different height, the structure of that. In North Dakota, generally most of our fencing is tied to private lands and a little bit less what maybe the DOT puts out there. But there has been a push to use fencing to guide animals to specific areas, such as accommodations. And those accommodations are things like paths under the bridge, and we actually have a couple of those in North Dakota, in Mayville and in Pembina, which are in eastern North Dakota. Or the more extravagant crossings, like we've heard about, which can actually, with fencing, reduce wildlife vehicle crossings by up to 96%. We have two crossings that are both underpasses here in North Dakota. The Long X Bridge was geared towards bighorn sheep, and the Lewis and Clark Bridge geared towards moose. But to know where you would put something like that requires data. The data we have in North Dakota is collected by law enforcement, primarily the North Dakota State Highway Patrol. And what gets reported to them is depending upon reporting requirements. Over the past 10 years, those reporting requirements have changed. Prior to 2013, any crash that was $1,000 in property damage or more got reported. And then after that, it got changed to human injury, and which was also a reporting requirement prior to that, but human injury or death, or it had to be more than $4,000 in property damage. And that led us to ask the question, how does the reporting requirements impact the data that we have to make these decisions about how we might put big infrastructure on the landscape and ultimately improve human safety? Well, we got data from 2005 to 2022, all right? And that crash data was all collected by the law enforcement, meeting these different criteria over that time period. I've broke it up by where those reporting requirements changed. But over that time period, we had over 30,000 wildlife vehicle collisions, which was an average of about 1,700 collisions a year, almost 1,800. But what I want you to notice is how much that changed as reporting changed. Prior to 2013, so this is 2005 to 2012, we were averaging almost 3,500 crashes per year being reported. And that was 92% of the whole data set was right there. I omitted the 2013 data just because the change happened during that year. But looking after that, at 2014 to 2022, we went down to just about 1,200 crashes in that pretty much same time period, or 133 annual crashes that we had to work with. Across the board, injury and human fatalities are always recorded, And you can see that those which, while great, it is fairly low, less than 800, it averages about 40 crashes per year, which is not a lot of data, ultimately, to make decisions. So the way that we collect the data can substantially limit what we can do with it. And our current reporting requirements here in North Dakota mean we have sparse data to work with. Now, what do we know from that crash data? Well, the first thing we need to know is what species are involved, because different types of mitigation works for different species. Well, our crash data shows that regardless of how we collected it and what that reporting requirement was, over 96% of all of our crashes in the crash database are from deer. I want you to remember that when Lawson gets up here. The other question is, how might things change through the year, or through the seasons, across the year? So are seasons an important event? Well, season definitely has an impact. And in fact, fall is our primary period at which, regardless of how we collect the data, it's prominent as a high time for wildlife vehicle crashes. Now recall, these are deer, and if any of you who deer hunt know that the fall is the dominant time when deer are moving for breeding season reasons. The other thing that coincides with the fall is those of us, as we think about fall, our days get shorter and shorter, and our morning and our afternoon commute happens at prime animal movements of sunrise and sunset, which probably ends up making that movement of deer with the breeding season even greater. What's interesting, though, if we only look at the injury and fatality data set, another thing emerges is that there's a peak in the summer that's almost the same as that in the fall. Now remember, that's a data set that only has about 40 crashes per year to work with. I want to talk a little bit about speed. Speed definitely is something that can have an impact. These two lines show you where you would expect the lines to be in terms of the proportion of crashes on the landscape relative to the proportion of roads that have those speed limits of 45 miles an hour. The middle is 45 to 65, or greater than 65. Now the green bars, the bright green ones all the way to the right on your graph, show you where that proportion should be in each of the expected categories. And then the other four represent the types of data we collected. The main take-home is that we have a lot more crashes happening at higher speeds, which makes sense. You have less time to react and ultimately stop your vehicle when you see an animal. And it happens a lot less on those speeds of less than 45 miles an hour. But it's hard to change all these roads to 45 miles an hour, so we still need to think about what are other options. How about lighting conditions? We know that animals predominantly move at times of dusk, dawn, and nocturnally. And what we found in our crash data set is that dark roads that are not lit stood out way above regardless of the data set. But that describes most of the North Dakota roads. And it's not really feasible to put lighting out there on every particular road all across the state. So we really do need to figure out, where are the crashes? You can use an analysis called hotspot analysis. And what you see here are two of those data sets. On the left is the all data, all crashes from 2005 to 2022. On the right is all the crashes between that same time period, but only involving human injury or fatality. And between those two maps, the big circles are around city centers with that all data, all right, years data, compared to that human injury and fatality where we start to see hotspots emerging in the western part of the state, predominantly around Highway 85. Your takeaway there, the amount of the data that we have and the way that we filter it can ultimately play a role in where we select to put our mitigation. It's been proposed that trying to find other types of data, such as carcass data, to add to crash data is really helpful. Because the different reporting rates that we have across different states and even across time can impact the results and how we think about where we should do our mitigation. So, improved data collection is something we really need to be thinking about to increase human safety and enhance wildlife conservation. Which takes us to our next speaker, Lawson, who's going to talk about what we're doing relative to a different kind of data collection.
All right, thank you, Susan. Hi everyone, my name is Lawson Frey. I'm a graduate student at the University of North Dakota, and I'm going to tell you about our carcass survey. So to quick run through some objectives here, primarily we wanted to develop a monitoring approach to augment or evaluate North Dakota's current crash database, and we did that through our carcass survey, which I'll get into here shortly. Second, we wanted to essentially take inventory of wildlife vehicle collisions in North Dakota. We wanted to identify what species were getting hit at what rates, and then where and when those collisions were happening. And then finally, we wanted to develop and evaluate a tool for wildlife vehicle collision data collection. And we did that through Survey 123, which again, I'll get into later. And the idea behind this was it would be something that we would use for our sampling, as well as something that we could transfer to either DOT or Game and Fish for future monitoring efforts. So to quick run through our methodology for our carcass survey, that map there shows our study transects. We had just over 2,000 miles of state highways that we sampled. We also had portions of I-29 and I-94 as part of the interstate highway system. We identified these roads through talks with DOT and Game and Fish, as well as factors like their geographic location, traffic level, and surrounding environment. On those roads, we conducted weekly surveys for carcasses from May to August and October to December of last year, so we had just about 6 months of weekly surveys. And then in addition to what you see on the map, we also had about 10% of our collections come from off-transect, and that was just primarily as we were traveling for other reasons or just on our daily commute, we would sometimes mark carcasses. So to get into our actual field methods, as I said, this was a driving survey, and we conducted this survey at medium speeds. When we were identifying what speed we wanted to conduct these surveys at, we had to find a balance between going slow enough to still be able to observe carcasses in the ditch and in the road, while also being fast enough to not pose a major safety risk to other drivers, and as well as having enough time to cover all 2,000 miles that we wanted to survey in a week's period. So what we settled on was 40 to 50 miles per hour on 2-lane roads and 50 to 60 on 4-lane roads. We were just a little bit quicker on the 4-lane roads because that was primarily I-29 and I-94 where the traffic's moving a bit faster. And if you look at that road there, that blue box is essentially what we were looking at when we were driving. So anything that was on the surface of the road, in the median, in between 2 lanes, or on either side of the ditch, or either ditches, that's what we were looking for. And in that area, if it was a 2-lane road or a 4-lane road, we would sample them in both directions so we could easily see both ditches. If it was a single-lane road, then we would just sample it in one direction and look on both ditches at the same time. And we would record any carcass that we saw in that area. We weren't specific for what species we were looking for. As long as we could detect it, we would pull over and record it. The process for pulling over, we would ideally notice a carcass before we were up even with it. We would turn our hazard lights on. We also had a small flashing light on the roof of our vehicle that we'd flip on. And then we'd just pull over onto the shoulder of the road and park as far off the road as we could and get out and record data about the carcass. And with all that, safety was our number one priority. There were certain instances where we had to either drive past a carcass or turn around for it just because it wasn't safe to stop. But ultimately, again, we were just trying to be safe on those roads. And then to ensure that we weren't double counting any carcasses, because some of these carcasses did persist from week to week, we just used a shared Google Maps file that had all the carcass locations on it. So each week we would extract all the data from our survey app and then load it onto that Google Maps file. And then once we'd pull over for a carcass, we'd just zoom in on ourselves and make sure there wasn't already a point there. So then for the tool we used to actually collect data, we developed a survey using ArcGIS Survey 123. It's just a form-based software for creating, sharing, and responding to surveys. That screenshot there shows us a little bit of what our survey looked like. So essentially, if you were to come up to a carcass and you wanted to record information about it, there's a little collect button that you would hit, and then it would bring you into that page. And ArcGIS would automatically grab your location and then the date and the time. And then you would just scroll down and respond to questions like, what species did you find? How fresh was it? Could you distinguish any demographics like the sex and the age? Where was it in relation to the road? You'd take a picture of it, and you could also leave any comments that you wanted if there were other details you wanted to include. And then also for deer species, we had some chronic wasting disease specific questions to help Game and Fish out with their disease management. But then you would just submit the survey and continue about on the rest of your transect. Should have gave you guys a graphic warning here, sorry about that, but here's a quick overview of some of our results. We had just over 1,900 total carcasses that we detected. More in the summer, we had over 60% of our carcasses come from the summer, but as we break down these results a little bit further, you'll see there's a little bit more to it than just that. White-tailed deer and raccoon were our 2 most recorded species, both at about 16% of our total data set. And then for the other large mammals, mule deer, pronghorn, moose, and elk, we had relatively lower numbers. In fact, mule deer was really the only one that was substantial with over 100. But the concern with these guys is they're bigger animals, so these are the ones that are usually going to cause the more damaging accidents. So to break down the results a little bit further, we'll break it down by species. For mammals, we had just over 1,200 total mammal carcasses. Again, more in the summer. Still on? Yeah, okay. If we look at our deer species here, our white-tailed deer on the left, mule deer on the right, it might be hard to tell in the audience there, but if you look from summer to fall, there was a pretty substantial jump in the fall, which, as Susan talked about, that's due to their breeding behavior. White-tailed deer went from about 150 to a little bit over 170. Mule deer had a very substantial jump from under 40 up to over 80. So that harpens back to the fact that those deer are going to be moving more in the fall, and there's likely going to be higher rates of collision then. Another quick caveat, our other category there in the summer, you can see it was one of our top 3 categories we recorded. The reason for that was these guys, the porcupine. In the fall, it dropped down quite a bit because we actually gave them their own category. We didn't list them as a species for the summer. I'm from North Dakota, and I didn't even know we had porcupine, but I've never seen so many in a single summer. So we gave them their own category, and then our other dropped down quite a bit. The remainder of that category was pretty much either unidentifiable carcasses or feral cats. For our bird carcasses, we had just over 640 total birds we recorded. Again, much more in the summer. Upland birds were our most recorded group that we found. Upland bird just refers to like grouse, pheasant, partridge, any grassland dwelling game bird. In our case, it was primarily pheasant. They were the vast majority of the birds that we counted. For our birds, it was primarily blackbirds and passerines, like the stuff that you would see at your bird feeder. We did actually give them their own category for our next field season here, so we'll get a better idea of trends with them. And that wraps up just our results. So now for our third objective, we wanted to evaluate Survey 123 as a tool for data collection. And this is applicable to other forms of data collection, not just wildlife vehicle collisions. But some pros are it's user-friendly for creators and survey respondents. You can make a survey or a data sheet in probably about an hour if you knew what your questions were going to be. So that's a big plus. It's easily distributable. If you wanted to share your data sheets with anyone, you can share them via QR code. You can post a link for them or share them on social media. So again, very nice. The big one for us was there's no cell connection required to submit surveys. So on some of those roads we were on, the cell service was pretty poor. So being able to save your response and then submit it later when you get back to cell connection is a huge plus. Another thing that's nice is if you are a survey creator, it gives you some quick access to coarse data analysis and visualization. It'll give you a breakdown of all your questions by their response, and you can filter different types of graphs that you want to depict that, and it'll give you some short summary statistics. And then also if you have a spatial aspect to your survey, it'll give you a map of all your recorded responses. Another thing that's nice too is if you want to export your data, you can filter it specifically. So if I wanted to take all the deer carcasses out from our data set, I could click a couple buttons and then get an Excel document with just the deer carcasses. So nice for that. Cons, there wasn't a ton of cons. It worked pretty good for what we needed it to. And the one that I have isn't really a huge con. It's kind of a case-by-case basis, but it can be expensive. If you were to just buy it as an individual, it would be about $700 a year for the license. But depending on who you're working for or the agency you're associated with, you might already have access to ArcGIS. It's one of their lower softwares, so if you have access to like ArcGIS Pro, then you've got Survey 123. And then to wrap everything up here, some of our next steps. We're going to repeat our collections as we did this past year for this coming summer and fall, so we'll have another 2 field seasons of collection. And then the ultimate goal of this project, of this phase of the project, is to compare what we find from our carcass surveys to what North Dakota has in their crash database over the same time period. And a little teaser for that is we actually got 2024's crash data a couple weeks ago, and after looking at it, we only had 48 wildlife vehicle collisions recorded in all of North Dakota all year. Well, if we think back to what I found, we had 1,900 total carcasses. And then if we think back to what Susan was saying about how 96% of the carcasses that make it into that crash database are deer, we had over 430 deer recorded. So that's just about 11% of what we recorded that actually made it into that crash database in all of 2024 versus 6 months of our sampling period. So there's already a pretty big discrepancy there. So we're excited to get into the next phase of our project and see how well that tracks between 2 full years. And then to wrap everything up here, wildlife vehicle collision mitigation, the most important part of it is data. Data is crucial. And what we think is that these carcass surveys, they can not only provide more data, but more valuable data. So the data that's collected from these surveys can be used to implement better mitigation strategies. And with that, I will toss it to Dr. Cramer.
Is my mic on? It is? Okay, thanks. Hi, thanks for being here today. I move around a lot, so I'm not going to stand there. First of all, I wanted to thank you for being here, and also I want to dedicate my talk to those people that are federal employees that are losing their jobs, already lost their jobs, or in a state of panic to know what's going to happen to them. As you know from working with them, it's a really tough road, and I really feel for them right now. I'll give you an outline. Oh, sorry about the mic there. Maybe if I stand away from that one. I'm going to talk about how you use the data that we just heard about, bring it into transportation planning, and give you types of proven solutions that we know work, because this might be something that's new to you, and I want to assure you you're joining a very big club that has really great results. I'm going to keep focusing on this particular wildlife overpass in Colorado. You'll see as an example of how well the overpasses can work. These are my research sponsors. I've been at this for a couple of decades now. I'm in my third decade. So I work with departments of transportation and wildlife agencies. I work with tribes and universities to bring scientific data on wildlife movements and analyze crash data to see where there's a nexus that we can find solutions for both. Why wildlife crossings? So my world, as I said, is a nexus. There's transportation reasons and wildlife reasons. Most of you know the transportation reasons, but that's always my first hook. You want to get motorist safety as the number one thing you start to look at, and from there we can bring in other information. Also, I wish I could ask questions of the audience, but the lights are so bright. Is there people here that are in maintenance? I was just wondering if you could raise your hand if I got maintenance folks here. Not that many, I can't see you. It's important for maintenance folks not to have to drag so many dead animals off the road. Not a lot of fun. And also your insurance costs. The insurance agents and companies, they just pass the cost of these crashes on to you. They're subscribers of the insurance, so you're paying for this. And then there's also just general cost to the public, losing your wildlife. On the ecological reasons, we want to protect wildlife. In our field, the three of us, we look at populations more than the individual, but we want to promote connectivity so animals can get to water resources, get away from a fire, go find mates, go to winter habitat when the snows are too deep. So it's important to see that they live in the same environment that they've always lived in, and we just put our roads through their houses. So we have to think about how do we make the world more permeable for them to get around and not get involved in crashes. And then one of the important things too is climate change. If we can find ways to make the transportation system more resilient to the things that are happening with climate change, those increases in the size of culverts, longer bridges, different things that help the infrastructure not get flooded out, or other things that happen, we can just put terrestrial pathways along creeks and wetlands and a bunch of other things that just go hand in hand with making your transportation system more resilient. So you have to establish a problem before you can fix it. So the data that we're talking about today is crash and carcass data, and then telemetry data about where wildlife moves. So I'm going to go into how that's used to help bring these two worlds together. So let's look at the motorist safety factor, because to me, that's what I always call the hook for those of you that are transportation engineers. So I worked on a pooled fund study with Federal Highways and Nevada DOT, and I censused every single DOT traffic safety office for all their crash data from 2014 to 2019, tabulated it all up, and I created this map, which is also in this article here if you're interested in it, to see what literally the cost of the reported crashes. And as Lawson showed you, that might only be like 89% of those in North Dakota. And what I want to show you in blue is the Midwestern states that you're part of. That area of the state, the region of the country, has the most crashes, the most expensive cost to them. yet you guys have the least amount of wildlife crossing structures. If you look at the West, it has the least amount of crashes and the most wildlife crossings. So some of this has to do with white-tailed deer, and or other species of animals, and if you're trying to protect populations. But overall, the numbers now are over $10 billion a year, and that was just 4 years ago, that these crashes are happening. And like Susan said, it's at least 200 people a year die from these crashes. So it's a big problem. If you want to read more, the Federal Highways Public Roads, 2 years ago, their winter magazine, I wrote an article for that to give you a lot more detail. But then I also want to show you in North Dakota, your relation to the other western states about the numbers. So if you look at these colors here, the green number in every state is the annual average crashes for that study I did that was completed in 2022. The pink is the percentage of all the crashes that are wildlife related. Again, these are reported crashes. And then the blue is the cost per state. And as you heard, the national average is 5% of all crashes are with wildlife. Well, you guys are part of an exclusive club. You're in the top 3 states of the entire nation with the greatest percentage of your crashes that are wildlife related. So only Wyoming and South Dakota have more percentage-wise of their crashes that are wildlife related. So this is a really big problem, even though it may not have risen to the level of your understanding or work, but I'm hoping that this shows you that there is a need to do something for this, for motorist safety. So let's look at the ecological information, because it's not just about crashes, it's about where do we need to accommodate wildlife. Bighorn sheep get killed in the Theodore Roosevelt National Park area, the North Unit on US 85. I'm going to show you more about how you in North Dakota have done something about that, but we don't want to see scenes like this too much. So we want to protect and restore connectivity. So you want the whole herd of elk to get across the road, or under the road or above the road, and keep people safe and wildlife safe. So the 2 things that we're doing right now in North Dakota is telemetry data with North Dakota Game and Fish, where they put the collars on the animals and they know where they move, and then carcass collection to know more about what's getting killed out there beyond the crash data. I'm going to give you an example from my Colorado study here. On your left is the Southern Ute Indian tribe put telemetry collars on elk and mule deer, and they live at the border, the animals and the people, North Dakota and Colorado. Excuse me, North Dakota, New Mexico and Colorado. And the telemetry data shows exactly where the elk want to go across the road. Well, the DOT and the wildlife people and the Sioux, or the Southern Ute Indian tribe, worked together, and they got wildlife crossings in there. They put an underpass exactly where the elk want to go, and an overpass a quarter mile to the east, where it was really worked in nice in the landscape. Now, elk are my problem child, and some of you might have problem children to know what that's like. You can't convince them to do something. So for years and years and years, you put in underpasses, and typically your elk herd's not going to use it. It takes at least 5 years for them to decide maybe they will. However, the overpass, which was a quarter mile from where they wanted to go, they love it, and they have been using it. And so what I'm saying is, you can train elk to move down the road and go over where you want them to go if you stick an overpass. So in the first year, we monitored October 2023 to 2024, over 7,000 times mule deer moved over that. That's 20 times a day. Elk moved over it almost 1,000 times, which is fabulous. And then you've got all kinds of carnivores going over it as well, so it's working really well. In fact, I was up late last night working with the New York Times. Keep an eye out in the New York Times in the coming days. They're going to feature this crossing structure and a story about wildlife crossings. The carcass data also show us who's going to be moving through. And we have the elk problem child, we have the bighorn sheep is somewhat of a problem child, and the pronghorn antelope, which is your skittish kid that's afraid to go across a fence, even though they can easily get across it. So when you learn more about who's got the problem where, you can prescribe the solutions for who they are and how they move on the landscape. So how do you bring all this information together in transportation planning? In this work that I do at the national level, the most important thing I can say is early is really, really important. the data that we're talking about has to go into the long-term plan and in programming. And programming has been overlooked by people in my field for 20 years. And so we're learning that we've got to get into your processes of planning. This again is from that national study I did, and it's, I call this the Yago slide, your eyes glaze over. So it's okay if your eyes are glazing over. Again, this manual that we created for the United States and Canada is available at my website, wildlifeconnectivity.org, and we show how you bring the transportation data and wildlife movement data and what the Wildlife Agency think is important, and you bring it into the process. And you keep bringing it into the process at different points. It doesn't, if somebody misses it at one point and somebody else catches it later. And it's important to bring the maintenance crews in too, because they can tell you where the problem is and if they're even going to take care of your mitigation, because they may not want what you want to put on the landscape. So what I do is I work with states creating wildlife action plans. You bring in layers and layers of GIS data and you throw them over the roads, and then every mile of road gets evaluated for how important it is and what you can do. And just to give you an idea, we score it. It's all quantitative, it's all scientific, and then it's very easily followed. And so to give you an idea, we've been doing this, I've been doing it for a while. I've done hotspot prioritization. I started with Idaho, but South Dakota, we had one in 2014. Again, you're looking at hotspots of crash data. We did it in Texas, and we did it in Utah. Now, then the next step up is to include the wildlife data. So in there, we've started doing it. The very first one was Idaho. We did it in Nevada, and I did it in Arizona. Then the next step up is you start bringing in even more information like modeling. And so New Mexico Wildlife Quarters Action Plan is the best one that we've done. 700 pages, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it incorporates a lot of information, including tribal information, wildlife corridors, and areas where they need to get across roads. Redoing it right now in Idaho, where I'm working in Massachusetts, Missouri, and in Washington. So lots going on with these action plans. Once you have a plan about where your priority areas are and where your opportunities are, you can bring them into transportation planning and all the way into project development. But I'd want to wrap up what I'm speaking about by how we know wildlife crossing structures work, because it may be a new concept for some people and maybe naysayers. So this part, if you got bored with me, this will be a little more interesting for you. I worked in Colorado State Highway 9, Steamboat Springs area, and look at the amount of crash and carcass data, how it dropped off. We reduced wildlife vehicle collisions in that area by 97%. 11 miles of road, 11 miles of fence, 2 overpasses, 5 underpasses. On the right is that fabulous overpass again. We monitor with cameras. We put them up there. You've got cameras on your wildlife crossings as well. And we look and see who comes, who goes through, who turns around. And in turn, that information gets fed back into your design process to see how to best design crossing structures for the animals at hand. So I want to talk about mitigation options very lightly. I'm mostly going to show you movies. We've got wildlife overpasses, as I've been speaking about. It can be over 2 lanes or 8 lanes of traffic. You have underpasses where animals are under the road. We've got exclusion fence that's 8 feet high typically that leads the animals to those structures. Guards are deterrents, so you take a double cattle guard or something like that. I actually work with electric pavement as well to keep the animals at the egress and ingress places from coming into the fenced area and getting trapped. If they're trapped, we put in escape ramps, and you can see some on US 85 there, mounds of dirt on the fence line. The animals jump down from the right-of-way into the wild area. So I'm gonna be the first of my movies. The first movie here is in Logan, Utah, where I used to live, and this structure was put in 1995, and look at all the animals using it. It's 13 feet high, 17 feet wide, and 165 feet long. It's totally amazing that these giant moose go in there. But I actually get to watch these baby animals grow up over the course of the summer of the photography pictures. This is a really fun one. And I apologize, this is Colorado DOT, but that's wrong. This moose goes into that culvert to take a nap. That's how comfortable they are. He's in there at 2 o'clock in the morning. The steer comes. 3 times she tries to pass. She finally gets past him, smells his butt, wakes him up. He's totally annoyed. As she's running out the other end, there's a red fox down at the other end of the culvert. There's the red fox, there's a deer, and the moose, he can smell the fox. And you could just like put a little blob over his head like a moose can't get any sleep these days. So it's real fun to look at these pictures and all the animal interactions. The next one here is research we did in Montana on US 93, south of Missoula. The majority of the animal was white-tailed deer, which of course would be interest to you. 19 wildlife crossing structures. This is a bridge that is fairly short, but the deer use it. It's really cool. I have to bend over to get there to get to the cameras. But you can see some interactions. She's got a lot of flies going there. But it's really dark under this. I think the road's 3 or 4 lanes at this point. And there's a light difference between the area where they're coming from and when they start to go in the structure. But the bucks follow the females in the fall. They might not, they're somewhere else all summer, but they show up and the females teach them. But this is functional connectivity. You've got the whole herd. Now, snow's different. Look at her breath. It's such a difference in the lighting, I believe, where it's bright where she is and dark where the structure is. They're a little hesitant, but they do eventually go through. So it's a very successful wildlife crossing structure. This one is an underpass in State Highway 9 in Colorado. We stopped monitoring officially on year 5, and this is what happened on year 6. Thank goodness somebody kept the cameras out. So the problem children learned how to use this underpass, which is, I love when animals prove me wrong, and they prove me wrong. This is what we love to see. This is that overpass in Colorado on Chimney Rock and 160. This is functional connectivity. It's not good if you just got the big boys going through. You need the whole herd. You need the mamas, the babies, and the big boys. And this worked out really well and still continues to work really well for all kinds of species. Then this is your North Dakota. It's a state highway underpass with the Lewis and Clark Wildlife Management Area south of Williston. These cameras are placed, they don't show you everybody, but, oh, this noise from the camera. Lawson and I were there yesterday, and there's incredible pathways underneath there. Lots of animals are using that structure. The Long X Wildlife Crossing is one for bighorn sheep. It's at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And last year, the Game and Fish put the numbers together, and 237 times wildlife came through, bighorn came through. And those of us in this field are so excited because these bighorn, your North Dakota bighorn, are proven they'll go under an underpass, and they rarely do that anywhere else. So you can see you've got the ewes, lambs have gone through, and you'll see who's chasing them. It's the big boy. So that one's working out really well. It takes several years for the animals to adapt. So where do we go from here? Just want to wrap up and say the DOT has partners in all these different agencies, which we started this talk with. So the DOT, you're not alone. You can have your partners do everything from archaeological surveys, that when the posts go in certain areas, they can put in the guards, they can work with county commissioners, and you can get some money if the Federal Highway Administration ever is allowed to give money out again. So I just want to wrap up by saying, never doubt the power of a few individuals to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I find this over and over again in all these states, that it's the people that are passionate, and if they've got someone's ear a little higher up to let them go forth and do some wonderful things, you will get a whole bunch of things going on in your state to help wildlife. So my hope is that I inspired you to work on this in your everyday and future work, and I hope you guys get a whole bunch more wildlife crossings. Thank you.
Mic check. Is this on?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, we have a few minutes for Q&A. Patty, do we have a mic runner somewhere? Okay, raise your hand if you want to ask a question. We'll have a mic runner come to you. Looks like there's a question right here. While that mic is coming up, I have a question to start off. So are these mitigative efforts species specific? And how do you determine if you're taking multiple species into account, how do you determine the right level of mitigative effort?
Yeah, I gotta use this one. Sure, it is species specific, and that's one of the reasons that Lawson's doing his work, because if we just know there's a crash but we don't know what the animals are, and like I was saying, you can get mule deer to go underneath like the road in these culverts like you see here. We do research, and one of the things I found out about the dimensions is you want to minimize the length that the animal travels underneath the road. You'll get more species going there. But overpasses work best for everybody, except for maybe the carnivores. But the elk, the bighorn and the pronghorn are all tricky. And if you don't have the opportunity to put an overpass in for pronghorn, you're probably not going to get them under the road. However, I didn't bring a movie in there, but we have trainer deer. Mule deer teach the other animals how to go over these things and through them. And so we can ask Utah and Wyoming if they want to chip over some trainer deer, and they'll train some of the other species to do it.
Go ahead with your question.
Hi. I actually have two questions, if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me. One is on the data collection portion. Have there been any considerations made for how we can expand data collection across the state? So obviously the ESRI license cost is a limiting factor, but could state agency staffs just in their normal day-to-day business as they travel through the state have some kind of system to report incidentally observed carcasses?
Yes, we've talked a lot about that, equipping a variety of different folks, whether that's DOT personnel, North Dakota Game and Fish, other folks that are on the roads regularly. And most of those organizations have ESRI licenses as well, so there's opportunities for them to work with the survey apps that we have. Plus, it's only the designer that really needs the license. We can send the link out, and anybody can contribute to that as well. So it isn't license prohibitive for who's collecting. Great.
My other question is around CWD. So it seems like a lot of these mitigation strategies effectively congregate ungulates and other animals into the same location. Are there any considerations for the management of deer, white-tailed deer, CWD as you move forward, or is that just so far down the road that we're not really thinking about that too much?
I would say on that one, actually, I don't think that they're necessarily congregating them. They're already coming through certain points, and so you are just facilitating them moving and crossing the road without getting hit. It's not like you've suddenly brought them in like a food source might do, where a food source would bring them to that. Most of these are placed in areas that already are problematic for crossing, and animals are using them. So I wouldn't say it would be something that would enhance CWD from that perspective at all. And for those that don't know what CWD is, that's chronic wasting disease, which is 100% fatal in your deer species. It's also in moose, but it is a major, major issue. We're still at the early stages of chronic wasting disease in this particular state, but many western states have it throughout their state.
Okay, we're at our time. I would encourage you, though, if you have questions, talk to the staff here. So the last question of this Q&A will be a question of me to you. Can you please give the team here a round of applause? Susan, Lawson, and Patty, thank you.